Hi, and welcome to this 4-point training series sponsored by the Consumer Voice. My name is Dr. Sherry Gibson. I'm a licensed psychologist and I specialize in geropsychology, meaning that I work in geriatrics. And I am so proud of this opportunity to partner with the National Consumer Voice in providing what I hope to be a meaningful and helpful training series um, targeted towards the care of residents in long-term care communities at both the administrative level, direct care service providers, and to families. This particular training today is going to be targeted for direct care service staff. And the topic of today's training is person-centered thinking. The intent for today is to really just get back to the basics on redefining and reminding ourselves of what is person-centered care, particularly during a time of COVID. And today I hope to share with you some tools to not only enhance or deepen your knowledge of your residents' needs, but also provide you with some valuable ways in order to create spaces where you can really understand your residents' needs and thereby focus and tailor your interventions that can be most helpful to them. Also want to probably highlight here the importance of behavioral and nonverbal indicators that can raise awareness of what's working and what's not working in your care of residents. Let me first say that your job as a direct care service provider is a heroic one. All of us are watching the day in and day out suffering that happens in long-term care because of COVID. And I also want to mention that it's a time of strength and resilience, and that people are really trying to come together in understanding how best to serve residents in long-term care communities. Across our globe and across the nation, a large number of cases have been reported. Thousands of people have died and millions of people have been affected. But no matter the number, each person is an individual, which reinforces the need for person-centered care. Before we start diving into person-centered thinking, I want to bring us back to kind of the godfather of person-centered therapy. His name is Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers had three main tenets around person-centered therapy. And that is that empathy, the ability to understand a person's suffering with an authentic desire to help, is at the core of therapeutic change. And that clients are viewed through a lens of potential, not through a lens of problem. And that therapists exhibit always a positive, non-judgmental regard for people. Just by definition, person-centered thinking means that we are supporting people rather than dictating what they should do or should not do or fixing. That could be really tricky, especially when you're providing direct care to people. How do we support people in their decisions? How do we support people in what they're asking for rather than just doing to them? It's a strength-based approach, and it builds off the existing strengths of the people we serve. It's knowing the personal story of those people, what is important for them, to them, so that we can build interventions about what's important for them. It's about building a culture of learning, partnership, and accountability, an approach used to discover meaningful information regarding that person, which then can be later used to create a person-centered plan of support. Person-centered thinking also aims to promote an individual's choice, their direction, and control of their life and the support that they receive. And it helps to ensure individuals are allowed positive control over their desired life and are recognized for the contributions to their community of choice. And lastly, are supported through paid and natural supports within that community. Some of the questions that we have to ask ourselves around creating a culture of person-centered care is we have to hold up the mirror and do some reflection, self-reflection, and also reflection on our organization, asking ourselves, how are we doing as a community? What's the language that we use that perhaps prevents us from being person-centered? Do we need to reframe the way that we describe people? People with problems, not problemed people. And again, it's shifting our perspective of knowing people and honoring what's important to them while balancing what's important for them. And I'll talk more about that later. Part of person-centeredness is really about active listening. When you walk into a resident's room, you automatically have power in that relationship just by virtue of being a provider of care. And the way that we balance power in a relationship is we stop talking and we start listening. When we allow the other person to tell us what they need, to talk to us, we balance that power and we become more equal with them. We also not only just give them the space to talk, but we have to actively listen to what they're saying. It's also about supporting people and making use of the community resources so that they can have the life they want to live, and providing support in order to assist people with making those things happen. There are 5 foundational beliefs to person-centered thinking. And the first starts out with a very important question when we are seated next to or across from a client or a resident. We want to ask ourselves, who is this person and what is important to that person? Person-centeredness really aims to change common patterns of community life. It fundamentally challenges the practices that separate people into an us and them category and thereby perpetuates controlling relationships. Honest, person-centered planning can only come from the respect for the dignity and completeness of a whole person. And by whole person, I see people through a frame of a biopsychosocial, spiritual type of framework. When we know all those pieces of a person, we truly appreciate the whole person. And finally, another foundational belief of person-centered thinking is that we assist people in defining and pursuing their desirable future, which tests that person's clarity, commitment, and their courage to do what they want to do. 2 important aspects of person-centered thinking, especially in long-term care as I see it, is quality of life and self-determination. So the first question is, what does quality of life mean to the person? Well, quality of life is just as diverse as we are. And we have to know what that means. And I'll give you an example that recently came into my life. I have a friend and a colleague who is 81 years old, and during COVID was diagnosed with a metastatic tumor located at the back of his tongue. My friend went through the surgical procedure to remove the tumor. He took the recommendations of his oncologist to take pharmacological treatments as well as initiating radiation treatment to stop the progression of the cancer. And it was during his radiation that he started experiencing the adverse side effects of that. He started having an incredible amount of fatigue, which really limited what he could do in his day. He had no energy. And then secondly, he lost the taste for food. And it was really the losing taste that started to diminish his quality of life. And after the seventh treatment, he went to his oncologist and asked, what would be the risk if I stopped the treatment? Because I can't taste my food. And frankly, I can't taste that dry martini that I enjoy at the end of every day. Well, the oncologist told him and his family that if he stopped the treatment, there's a 15% chance that the cancer could return. And my friend at 81 years of age decided that he wanted to stop, that his quality of life was much more important. Him being able to enjoy a meal and to taste his dry martini and to have the energy to get up and sit in his garden outweighed the risk of the cancer potentially returning. And I think that that really highlights these two very important aspects of care, which is quality of life and a person's self-determination. And embedded in that is this delicate balance between autonomy and what we would call dignity of risk. So as providers, our job is to inform people of what those risks are in any decision that they're making. And as long as they have the capacity, and by that I mean the mental capacity to make their decisions, that a judge has not determined that they lack that capacity and they are their own decision maker, that they have the ability to do that. And so as a provider, our responsibility here is to document that, that choice, document the information that we've given to the person, their choice, their how they've weighed the risks and benefits of any decision, and to make sure that we are supporting them in that decision, even though it may seem risky, even though it could seem eccentric to us. And all of these components that I've just described here, I believe are germane to long-term care communities. So I want to give you a couple of tools that you can use as a direct service provider. These are tools for you to analyze what's working and what's not working in your care as you embrace person-centered care, and ways that you can take action towards person-centered thinking. And I've used here a cartoon of a provider saying, our policy is patient-centered care. So you have to fill out forms AB 6 through 12, MR 7 through 9, and XE 113. And the client sitting across from the table says, don't you mean paper-centered care? And I think this is really true, that sometimes we get away from person-centered thinking that we're doing it by having people check boxes and telling us in that way who they are and what they're about. And really, person-centered thinking is about relationship. We don't build relationship through forms, through checking boxes. We build relationship through communication, through listening, through asking important questions to really understand the whole person. I mentioned this earlier, and I'll mention it again, that it's important that we understand values of the people we're serving. So just asking the question, what's important to you? What's most important in this day, or in your care, in your quality of life? And I've listed here a couple of things that come up. It might be comfort or happiness or contentment, fulfillment and satisfaction. And when we know that, then we can determine in our interventions, in our care, what's important for their health and safety, or for them to be a valued member of your community. I use this tool a lot with families when I'm working with maybe adult siblings who have very different ideas about how care should be delivered to their parent. And they are at odds with each other, with the parent, and certainly that comes across to the care team. And so one of the things that I'll ask the family, particularly the adult children, I'll first start with them. What do you know is your mother or father, grandparents' value? What is most important to them? And it's even better when the resident can speak for themselves and tell the family what's important to them. And then what I do with that is I remind at every decision-making juncture that we come to that value so that all the interventions are anchored around what is most important to the resident. And if people can get on the same page around a value, they can usually come to a negotiation around the interventions, because we can't argue against the value. The value is the value. One way to do this, and having a discussion about who's really important to an individual, is what I call a relationship map. And what I'll do is I'll draw 3 circles: a small circle, a bigger circle, another big circle around. And I ask the person, tell me who's in your inner circle. Who are the people who are most closest to you? And if they can't come up with somebody, I'll say, well, let me give you an example. Let's say you had an emergency in the middle of the night. Who's the first person you would call, knowing that they would answer that call? And then I would ask them, okay, now who's in this next circle and who's in the further out circle? This gives you an understanding of who that person talks to, and it also gives you some understanding of who you can talk to that has the closest relationship, or who is in that trusting circle with the individual. I also use this when I'm asking questions of the people who are involved with the resident. I might ask them, what do you like most about Mr. and Mrs. Smith? What do you admire about them? When was the last time you had fun together? And the answers reveal very important things. They reflect a personal or working relationship with that individual, and sometimes they don't. I want to really be persistent in asking of those people who the resident has identified being in their closest circle. I want to be persistent in asking those like, admire, and fun questions, and listen for the personal connection that people have. Because the resident may identify their brother as being that person, but in talking with the brother, you might get a different picture. And those relationship maps can be vitally important in your care. Another tool I'd like to share with you is what I call the working or not working tool. This exercise is really a simple way of analyzing what's happening in someone's life from more than just one perspective. It can help identify whether what is important to them is present in their life and whether they are being supported in a way that makes sense to them. Problems sometimes surface where there are areas of disagreement in people's lives. By looking at what's working and what's not working from different perspectives, it becomes clear that there is agreement and maybe areas where there's a difference. So the way that this applies to your job as a direct care service provider is that when you're having discussions with your peers about the care that you're giving to a resident, taking in the perspective of other care providers to know what's been working or what's not been working. And you want to get the perspectives not only from the staff, but also from the family, maybe from your administrator, and maybe from the resident themselves. And that's really an important piece here, asking the person themselves what worked and what didn't work. This can be used to look at a particular issue or a particular problem that came up or a circumstance. It can be translated from everything from a fall that happened to an emotional outburst, to a disruption in a relationship, to bathing and hygiene care. And the other important piece of this tool is that when you understand what hasn't worked, you want to talk about negotiation. So if this hasn't worked, what can we try next? And in negotiation, particularly if it's with family or with the resident themselves, you want to make sure that the person feels listened to. You want to start on common ground. What can everybody agree on here? And you want to be unconditionally constructive in those conversations. What do I mean by unconditionally constructive? Well, essentially, it means that no matter how tempted you are to take sides, you don't. You don't criticize other people's perspectives. And what you'll notice is that solutions will pop up when you facilitate those discussions well. Another tool is called the donut. So the donut is a way to think about and identify specific roles and responsibilities of people in any particular situation so that people know what has to be done in a particular way and where they can experiment and be creative. It also identifies what is not part of someone's role. I'll give you an example here. I'm going to use Carrie. And Carrie had intellectual and developmental disabilities and lived in a group home. Carrie had a caregiver whose responsibility it was, one of the responsibilities I'll say, was to help her do things um, that were pleasing and meaningful in her life. And one of the things that Carrie loved was arts and crafts. And so one of her favorite activities was to go to the craft store and look through the crafts and come up with an art project. And sometimes she already had an art project in mind, and sometimes she didn't. But the caregiver's job would be to ask Carrie on a Friday afternoon if she had an art project and if she'd saved up enough money and if she wanted to go to the craft store on the weekend. So let me just give you an example of how this would play out. Caregiver would check in with Carrie on a Friday, determine that they were going to go to the craft store on Saturday. Caregiver would pick her up and they'd go to the craft store, and Carrie on the way to the craft store would talk about this particular art project that she was looking forward to doing. They'd get to the art store, and this was one of Carrie's favorite things to do, would be to walk down each and every aisle, meticulously looking at every single item and putting those items that she liked into her basket. Well, inevitably, at the end of her shopping trip, she'd have way too many items over the amount of money that she could spend. So the caregiver would first ask Carrie, looks like you have too many items in your basket and you can't afford it. What do you think we should do? Carrie would say, well, I guess I have to put some items back. Caregiver would say, how do you think we should do it? I don't know. So here caregiver would use some creativity and say, how about we do this? You mentioned you have this art project you're working on. What if we went through every item in the basket and you only keep the items that pertain to that particular art project? You might have enough money at the end of this exercise. Okay, so they'd go through each and every item and make decisions about which item was useful to the art project and which wouldn't. Now you can imagine, as I imagine in this situation, that takes a lot of time. Let's pretend that the caregiver, because they're rushed for time, and let's say that caregiver has 3 people that he has to take on outings that day. And in a rush for time, caregiver just says, you know what, Carrie, I see you're about $20 over. Tell you what, I'll give you the $20. You just pay me back next month when you get paid out of your allowance. Now, what are the risks of that caregiver stepping out of the boundary? Well, the risk is that Carrie doesn't learn an important social skill, an important life skill of managing her money, of decision making. And so by doing, we become imbalanced in our responsibilities, which then does not allow for creativity and judgment and working with the person. And when there's an imbalance of those things, then we step out of the boundary and we do things that are not our responsibility. So giving Carrie that money was outside of the responsibility of the caregiver. So when you look at the donut, you see that the actual donut itself, that should be empty. That should be the area in which you use judgment and creativity in your care with residents. The core responsibilities is that area in the center. And when that area becomes too large because there's too many responsibilities, we are at risk for going outside of what we are called to do with people. and we are at risk for not using creativity and good judgment in our work with people. So again, those three areas is what's important in our work, to what are we supposed to do as instructed as part of our jobs. The judgment and creativity portion of that is what have we tried to see if what works and what doesn't work. And anything outside of that is not our responsibility. I think this exercise can really help clarify the roles of different people, and particularly in long-term care in the support of residents. This can feed into the care and support planning and can also be used to sort roles and expectation of a care team. Another tool that you might consider is what I call 4+1. And essentially this can happen at the end of a situation that comes up, maybe an incident that occurs with a person, and you simply want to ask yourselves as a care team, or ask yourself as a care provider, what have we tried? What did we learn in this situation? What can we be pleased about, and what are we concerned about? And where do we go next? I love this tool because I think that we get really caught up in responding to the crisis, and we forget to go back and try to learn from that crisis. This gives us a moment of reflection that doesn't have to take a lot of time, but can be really constructive. And this is person-centered thinking, because we are analyzing the situation so that we can be more person-centered moving forward. Another tool is a learning log. And this came out of a situation also at a group home with a woman we'll call Beverly, who had a congenital birth defect where she had her organs developed on the opposite side of her body. You can imagine what kind of medical problems she had right from birth all through her life. And Beverly was conflicted and traumatized every time she had to go to a doctor's appointment. She would get very anxious. She would start crying. She'd just been poked and prodded her whole life. And anytime she had to go to an appointment, it just re-traumatized her. So the staff at the care home had really worked hard to use a person-centered approach with Beverly. And so some of the things that they did with her is they wouldn't tell her about the medical appointment days in advance. They'd wait until the morning of the appointment to let her know, because what they learned was that she would become so ruminative and her anxiety would take a very disruptive turn in her own psychological well-being. She'd stop eating, she wouldn't sleep, she just became perseverative about it. So they changed the way they did that. The other thing that they would do is they would show up right at the time of the appointment so that Beverly didn't need to be sitting in the waiting room for long. And the doctor's office also worked with the staff to make sure that happened. Well, on one particular day, Beverly's caregiver took her to her medical appointment. They got to the doctor's office and the receptionist said, "I'm so sorry, but the doctor was caught in an emergency surgery. He's going to be about an hour late to the appointment." Well, the caregiver immediately started to feel a little panicked because she knew that Beverly would be very anxious. So she saw a car wash across the parking lot and she said, "Beverly, I need to wash my car. Let's go to the car wash." And it's the kind that you drive through. So they get in the car, they start moving through the car wash, the water turns on, the brushes start, and Beverly just starts laughing. She is like a little girl, laughing and talking about the water, and she's just really enjoying herself, to the point that the caregiver went through it twice. She really took advantage of that moment. And what she learned about Beverly is that this was like a whole new thing that helped her anxiety, that actually she approached the doctor's appointment that day feeling better than when she had started out. Well, when the caregiver got back to the group home with Beverly, she told her staff what had happened. Everybody was so excited about it. The therapist, the counselor who showed up the next day, heard the rumors about this story, and she logged on to the chart to see what had been written about it. And here's what the chart read. Took Beverly to her medical appointment. Provider mentioned that she needed to have follow-up labs in 2 weeks, made an appointment in 2 weeks. Signed, dated. Nothing in that chart note said what happened with Beverly that day. The very important thing that that staff learned about her, what was important for her, what she loved about that day, and how it changed her. And so from this, we developed a learning log. And in the learning log, essentially, it's about what do we know about the person? We put in the date. What did the person do? Who was there? What did you learn about what worked well? And what did you learn about what didn't work well? This really gives you a process to help you record what you're learning while you're supporting somebody. It's most useful when people are trying out new activities or being supported by new staff members, for example. By capturing that information and reviewing it, the whole team can learn and keep learning how best to give support. I think crucially, these learning logs ensure that an in-depth knowledge and understanding of a person is shared with the wider team so that they too can support a person well. They should be reviewed regularly by the team and shared with people who are involved in the support. By viewing it, the whole team can learn how best to support the person. So you can ask, what else can you do? Well, I think an important thing, most importantly, is to listen, listen, listen. Relationships is critical in long-term care communities. You know this. I'm just preaching to the choir. A relationship is so important. What's being said to you indicates your success, or it may say that you need a different approach. And I put said in quotations here because said is not just what the resident or families tell you, but it's also nonverbal communication. And we know that nonverbal communication makes up 85% of all communication. When a person winces, or when they sigh, or when you see a tear roll down a cheek, this is an opportunity for you to listen. It's an opportunity for you to see what might be going on and inquire about that further. It's also an opportunity to validate it or to notice it and describe it for the person. I see that you look upset. I see your fist is clenched. Are you angry? I see you have a tear rolling down your cheek. Can you put a word to those tears? Person-centered thinkingness really embraces a philosophy of being with people rather than doing to people. Standing side by side with them and knowing that whatever care I'm giving to that person, I want to be on the receiving end of that care when I too live in a long-term care community. I really like the metaphor of the lotus. Lotus flowers, which are beautiful, delicate flowers, grow from very adverse environments, such as mud. And I think about the opportunities we all have for growing and for creativity through this context of adversity of a global pandemic. Person-centered care and person-centered thinking is a strength-based philosophy. It's a philosophy that we don't just use when we clock in at our shift, but it's one that we wake up with and we go to sleep with. We use it in our day-to-day interactions, not only with residents and families and our peers, but also with our neighbors, our family members, our grocery store clerk, and even our baristas. Remember coffee shops? They were so great. Person-centered thinking is best modeled by you. You have an impact. When you embrace it, when you hold people accountable to person-centered thinking, you create systemic change that reverberates across all levels of care and ultimately affects residents and families. You have a positive impact. I want to share with you some resources that are available to you through, these are person-centered resources, both through Consumer Voice and also through the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center. You can access them through these links. And here are some other resources and ways to connect with those very important resources available to you. I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for the heroic work that you do day in and day out. And we also want you to know that we are here to support you in all the best ways that we can so that you're providing the highest level of care to residents of long-term care communities. Thank you so much, and I wish you the best.